when half of your army are people from the private sector, and you tell the American people, well, we only have 130,000 troops in Iraq, that doesn't sound as bad as we actually have 250,000 U.S. forces there. The reality is there are 500,000 personnel on the U.S. government payroll fighting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq right now. 500,000 people. They come from 100 countries around the world and work for 600 corporations, yet no one ever talks about it. So why does Obama do it? Why did Bush do it? Because they wouldn't be able to wage these wars of aggression and conquest without them.
Yeah. Well, I know that just in terms of the Army's occupation, it's a pretty small percentage of the infantry who are actually the ones sent out into the pitched battles, and there's, a million men of support for every one guy actually out there fighting or what have you. But how do those numbers break down? And I don't know, obviously I'm making those numbers up, but do you know, what the ratio is of actual, armed combat people that are mercenaries versus people who are peeling potatoes or whatever?
Right. Well, we don't know for sure because there's never been an effective accounting system. In fact, in the recent Government Accountability Office report on it, there's all sorts of estimates, and I'll give you those in a second, but no one ever really knows. I mean, when I testified in front of the Congress, Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, in front of the Appropriate Committee, told me that she learned more from me talking there than she has in 2 years of questioning government and military officials, because the fact is that they're not forthcoming with the statistics. It's not in their interest to publish them or make them available to the public. But the reality is that you have about 160,000 contractors in Iraq right now. Of those, you have approximately 25 to 30,000 of them are armed contractors. And that's just counting those that are on U.S. government contracts. In other words, you don't just have contractors working for the Department of Defense or the State Department, but KBR hires its own contractors, and they're not counted in that armed contractors, and they're not counted in that number. So somewhere in the ballpark of 25 to 30,000. The other part of this that's important, though, Scott, is that what we're seeing, the Obama administration strategy in Iraq right now is the same as Bush's when he left office. They are trying to implement what's sort of known in military circles as the Iraqification of the occupation, meaning they're trying to get Iraqi forces to essentially do all of the blood work while the U.S. calls the shots. And that's what this whole myth of the U.S. withdrawing from the cities is about. You actually try to encourage the Iraqis to take more of the bullets than U.S. soldiers, but the U.S. is still running the show. It's a classic sort of colonialist operation.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me this. It seems like most of the people that I talked to, Patrick Coburn and Gareth Porter, and interviewed Red Gerard last week, talked about this, and there seems to be a consensus among my favorite experts anyway that Maliki and his coalition that he's put together is basically dependent on his position against the United States. So thanks a lot for helping me build my army, but now, from his point of view, the only way he can even maintain any legitimacy at all is by allying with all the nationalists in the country against the United States occupation. And it seems to these guys, at least the way they explain it to me, that the United States is actually going to get kicked out. Not that, General Petraeus wants to leave or, that was the plan all along or anything like that, but that they really are. They've installed people in power who actually are powerful enough that they don't need us and are in fact going to insist on a total withdrawal from their country. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I recently did a public event with Patrick Coburn. I interviewed him publicly at the Brecht Forum in New York, and then I was just recently on another radio show with him, and I have tremendous respect for him. I loved his book on Muqtada al-Sadr. I have some minor disagreements with some of Patrick's analysis, as well as Raya Jarrar, who I have tremendous respect for as well. I think that much of what you're characterizing them as saying is true. I think that Maliki has allied himself with forces that are overtly opposed to the U.S. occupation for domestic political reasons. He has an election that's not too far on the horizon. He needs to not be perceived as a U.S. puppet. But I also think that the United States has allowed him to sort of go off the ranch a bit and criticize the United States. It's very telling that Maliki slammed the occupation in speeches in Baghdad, in interviews with the Iraqi media, and then comes to the United States in Washington and is asked a question at a gathering of U.S. policymakers and says, oh, yeah, but the United States may have to stay longer than 2011, which is something I've been reporting for a very long time. I do think that it's impossible to imagine that every single U.S. soldier is going to leave Iraq anytime in the near future. I think that they're going to keep in place what Obama said, which is a residual strike force of somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50,000 U.S. troops that can intervene at a moment. Perhaps some of them will be positioned in Kuwait or one of the other client states of the United States in the region, and they'll be able to hammer away, and you'll have U.S. military advisors. That is what the Iraqification of the occupation means. But don't be under any illusion that Maliki somehow has the overwhelming support of the Iraqi people. Polls just contradict that left and right, and that's I think it's going to be very fascinating. I think Patrick, Raed, myself, others who follow Iraq closely, we all generally are on the same page, maybe with some slight disagreements about the particulars of who Maliki is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, though, it doesn't really come down to what the people of Iraq as a whole think, in a sense. It's what the armed political factions, or at least ones who could be separate armed political factions are participating in the state, what compromises they're willing to come up with. Like, from what I understand, Muqtada al-Sadr has said, I mean, partly because he was beaten by by Maliki's forces and then by ours, but he said, look, I'll go ahead and support you as long as you're insisting on withdrawal. But if you stray from that at all, it's on again. Things like that. He seems to be holding the coalition together based on the promise that he's going to be a nationalist and force us out.
Right. Let me tell you who you should have on your show if you haven't already, who I consider to be, if not the best expert on Iraq, certainly the most experienced reporter in Iraq under the occupation. That's Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films. He has done incredible documentaries. Richard Rowley from Big Noise Films, Big Noise Tactical Media. He has an incredible understanding of all of the armed factions in Iraq, has traveled with them, been embedded with them, and has been a true media hero, and no one picks up his work in the States because he does it for Al Jazeera. And he's in Honduras right now covering the coup there. But Rick Rowley would be the guy to have on to talk about all of these various factions and answer exactly what you're saying. He's the mascot.
Cool. Well, I sure appreciate that recommendation. It's duly noted, and I'll try to act on as fast as I can. Let me ask you about this in the last couple of minutes here about the assassination program and all this controversy. You have an article questioning whether Obama is actually continuing the very same policy that the media frames as simply one of these off-the-books Dick Cheney, David Addington exercises here.
Right. I mean, I think both things might be true. I don't doubt for a minute. I think we don't even know a fraction of the shady, unconstitutional, unlawful, extrajudicial conduct that was being authorized regularly by Dick Cheney. We saw the recent report on Democracy Now! Where you had U.S. Army intelligence infiltrating Students for a Democratic Society in Tacoma, Washington, infiltrating these organizations, direct violation of Posse Comitatus. You had Cy Hirsch talking about the executive assassination ring. I think we don't even know, we haven't even scratched the surface of what Dick Cheney was involved with. The point I was making is that these Democrats who now express outrage that there's an assassination program or talk about how, it's somehow some nefarious thing that Bush and Cheney were doing, obviously don't want to bring up the fact that Bill Clinton signed several lethal findings, as they're called, in the 1990s to assassinate various individuals that were considered declared enemies of the United States. The Obama administration regularly carries out Israeli-style targeted assassinations in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and yet you have executive orders on the books going back to the Ford administration, the Reagan administration, the Carter administration. In fact, Oliver North wrote some of these himself, explicitly banning the assassination of individuals by U.S. intelligence forces. So I think that in order to have a thorough investigation of the CIA assassination program, you would have to be willing to dig into the closets of Democratic power players, and I just don't see that happening. Unfortunately, this is still being portrayed as a partisan issue rather than the bipartisan hit squad that it's been for decades.
Well, and I'm always confused about some of this stuff, too, because, I talk with the other Scott Horton, the legal expert on all this war crime statutes and all these kinds of things a lot, and there seems to be, in his perspective, a clear line between what's war crimes and what isn't, what's prosecutable and what isn't, and what's a violation of this, that, and the other statute, and yet the National Security Act of 1947 says, oh yeah, and the CIA, by the way, from time to time can do other things that the president imagines he wants them to do. And so basically they've already legalized this, generations ago, that's what the CIA is for, doing things that are illegal by definition. That's why it's covert, because they're crimes.
Right. I mean, I think that, Noam Chomsky, I think has been right about this all the time. The issue isn't whether or not it's legal. The issue is U.S. exceptionalism. The issue is, the U.S., believing that it has the right to act militarily all over the globe whenever it pleases. Legalism is only one aspect of this. It's one the Democrats are very fond of speaking of. But I also think there's an issue to be made of just the overall justness of it. Or is this actually going to make us safer as Americans? I think overwhelmingly the answer is no when it comes to both Clinton-Obama-style foreign policy and, Bush-Reagan-style foreign policy. Both of them make us a less stable, less safe nation.